All right, welcome everybody. It's 5 o'clock, actually a little after 5 o'clock, not just anywhere, but it's 5 o'clock right here, and we're gonna taste some wine again for about the 6th or 7th time, I guess, that we've done this. Looks like we've got 37 points of folks logged in, so maybe about 50 or 60 people. Thank you very much for joining us this week. For those that are new, and I know there are some this week, this is something that we've started doing since the shelter in place went into effect here at Thomas Fogarty Winery, and it's something that we might continue. We've had a lot of positive feedback on it. A lot of our allocation holders, people who buy our wines regularly out of the area and can't often come to our open houses, have told us they enjoy this, and we're kind of more comfortable with it, I think, than we thought we might be. So we'll probably keep doing it. And we hope you'll keep joining us. We are also on Facebook this week for the first time. We're sort of simul streaming, although there's a 15-second delay on Facebook. So welcome to everybody that's joining us on Facebook. You will be able to interact not just through Zoom, but through Facebook, just in the chat section, or I think there's a comments area underneath the streaming video. We won't get to those questions as quickly, but we're going to try to answer quite a few when we're done trying the wines. We do this, of course, to reach out to folks, since we're in this odd situation where we can't have people here physically, and we just thank you again for taking the time to join us. The way this works, we do 2 wines typically per week. The wines are available. We can send them to you anywhere in the world that you are, so that you can join us and taste the wines along with us at the same time. That's not necessary, of course. You can learn about the wines. If you're in our allocation program, you're probably going to receive these wines if you haven't already. And of course, a lot of folks just call and order them after these little stream sessions, if they like how the wines sound to them. Dushan's going to put up the information for reaching us and how to get these wines, both I think during and then after our session today. We look forward to opening our doors again to everybody, but until that happens, we're gonna be right here. I'm with Nathan Candler, our wine grower, the person responsible for the wines that you're about to enjoy, and also Michael Martella, our founding winemaker, is here somewhere.
I'm here.
He's here, and we're going to be joined eventually by John Toigo, who is the sommelier and the wine director at the Ritz-Carlton Half Moon Bay, a great place that we have a wonderful relationship with. I think I'll hand it over to Nathan right now, and he can talk about the wines, introduce the wines, introduce himself, and say anything he thinks is worth saying right now.
Cool, thanks, Tommy, and thank you guys all for joining us again this week. I think we're going to start today's session with a quick kind of catch up on what's going on in the vineyards. We showed a few pictures, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, and we thought we might make that a regular part of this. So if you can't make it up to the winery, just pick up your wines curbside. You can kind of follow along with the progress of the vineyard kind of as we go. We finally have gotten some warm weather here at the winery, so the cover crop is really taking off. We've begun to mow the cover crop. We're going to start turning that into the soil, sort of our green manure. It's the way that we naturally fertilize the vineyard. And here you can see, this is the Albaton vineyard. This is baby Chardonnay shoots just beginning to grow from the season. And you can see, you know, those buds on that vine pushed out, gosh, maybe close to a month ago. And that's all the growth we've had. And they will probably double that growth in the next couple days with the warm weather we had today. We almost hit 80 up here at the winery. It's a beautiful, beautiful day. This is a shot of the cover crop and the vines in the Windy Hill Vineyard. This is Pinot Noir. So these are young vines that were replanted in 2012. So this is the youngest vineyard here at the estate. And you can see a giant fava bean plant right next to that with its flowers The cover crop on that vineyard is taken off. And faba beans, or bell beans as farmers call them, are legumes, and they help to add nitrogen naturally to the soil by creating a symbiosis between fungus and bacteria in the soil. So very important plants, very important part of the kind of natural fertilization scheme we have here at the winery. So hopefully those will kind of follow along, maybe the same, maybe not the same vines, but the same vineyards every week, and you guys can you can follow along and see how things are you know, week to week, and you can see the progress of the vineyard. Michael, do you have anything you want to say before we start? Thanks for joining us again.
Hey, it's great to be here. I'm down here in the Fogarty Salon. There's a little tasting room that I guess it's the VIP tasting room. So somehow I get to be in here. So it's pretty special for me to be here.
Yeah,
It's always a great time of year.
And we're losing Michael.
Have you lost me?
It's so far underground that the Wi-Fi is.
I don't know what to say. If maybe I'm not here. Anyway, I always love this time of the year because the buds are breaking. You know, they popped out, and really activity in the vineyards is really ramping up now. Mowing of the cover crop, and then spading that cover crop in. It's really one of my favorite times of the year.
Yeah, I completely agree, and especially sort of given the current situation in the world, it's enlightening. You know, it feels good and refreshing to see new growth and energy, and that positive kind of energy that's kicked off by the vineyard this time of year has been a nice salve compared to all the negativity in the news. So we encourage all of you that are local to come by and pick up your wine, and you can get a nice view of what's going on, because it's an awesome time of the year, as Michael said. But I think we're ready to kick into the wines. Anything else we want to? Any other housekeeping before we get started? No. So we are going to begin tasting 2016 Razorback Vineyard Pinot Noir. On the map that's currently on the screen, the Razorback Vineyard is number 7, way up in the top right-hand corner. And this is the lowest elevation vineyard on the property here. It sits, gosh, just about 1,400 feet in elevation. It is a 2-acre vineyard of Pinot Noir that was planted in 1986. I'm going to pour some wine for Tommy and myself.
Thank you very much. You know, while Nathan's pouring that, Michael, I will say I think it's the official growing season. The growing season is officially upon us when we have our first tractor mechanical failure, and that did happen today. I know you missed that probably more than anything.
Yeah, right. But they're always good fun projects to work on.
You want to come over and take the cab off the New Holland for me?
I know a guy to call. I got a phone number.
There's at least one little perverse part of you, Martello, that wants to dig into that tractor with a bunch of tools. I know it.
Yeah.
So Razorback Vineyard, it's the lowest elevation vineyard here again. Some years it's the first to ripen. It sort of depends on how the fog sits in a given growing season. If the fog is really compressed, sometimes that vineyard can be quite cold because the marine air in the morning really sits low and keeps that vineyard cool. Other years it's actually a warmer vineyard because it's more protected. It's further away from the Pacific. So it kind of depends on the season. And the soils in this vineyard are actually pretty distinctive from the rest of the property. These soils are called Purisma, and they are near shore sandy loams, and they're only about 6 million years old, which in soil terms is, you can see there in that picture how the marine layer really settles in there. This is during harvest a few years ago. But these soils being 6 million years old, in soil terms, those are like infantile. And there's also a streak of volcanics in this soil. What that means, I think, in the flavor of the wine, in sandy soils and volcanics, I think you get a real fine kind of fresh character. real vibrant acidity, oftentimes really high toned, kind of like floral, spicy, kind of savory character. And it tends to be a little bit softer in tannin, though. I don't think the wines have quite the grip that the Rapley wine, which we'll try next, have. And these are actually fossils that were pulled out of the vineyard. So these near shore soils, being young, they actually have, you can see these bivalves, your clams of some sort that are actually kind of trapped in the sedimentary soils of the vineyard. So it's pretty cool.
So Razorback is the vineyard that's sort of right above the house that our family lived in. There's a lot of distance, what, 600-700 feet plus, Nathan, between the bottom of Razorback and the top of Windy or the top of Langley, but it's really what we sort of consider the bottom of the hill. It's an interesting vineyard. It's the only vineyard that has a redwood tree in it. It's here at the northern estate. And until a few years ago, it had a willow tree in it. So we know that there's some subterranean moisture there for sure.
And we just got joined by John. Thanks for joining us, John. How are you?
Happy to do so. Thanks for having me. I'm always great.
Right on. So again, John is the head sommelier and wine director, beverage director, I should say, at the Ritz in Half Moon Bay. We're very honored to have him join us. And
honor's mine.
Yeah, taste the wine. Do you want to give some impressions, what you think about the Razorback, and any thoughts?
I mean, first impression, it just opened. Very high tone, very floral. There's a wonderful sort of undercurrent of something almost savory, kind of a savory meat-like characteristic that comes through while still delicate flowers, very pretty, very elegant. Obviously, the acid in it is racy, but well integrated. It's a beautiful wine, really it is. I'm not just saying that because all three of you are on the thing with me. But, really stunning. This is the kind of Pinot that I know I could have open on a table for an hour or more, and it's just going to keep evolving as well. It's great.
Michael, what are your initial thoughts on Razorback?
Well, I really, this one always is very savory, more so than the Rapley. And I'm being distracted by my video, which is working half the time. And it's also, it definitely drinks younger than the Rapley. It drinks younger than most of our Pinots.
Yeah, Razorback.
Well, one of the reasons I really like this wine, we didn't always make single vineyard wine from Razorback, and when we started, it was really neat that it was a much more sort of friendly wine. It didn't lack complexity, it doesn't lack intensity, it doesn't lack sophistication or anything like that. But it's not one of those wines that when you open it, say it's only 2-3 years in the bottle, and you kind of put it in the glass and you smell it and you go, oh my God, that's such a serious wine. I should never have opened it. It needs time. It's not that wine. The wine is really sort of giving, and it's got a lot of sort of friendliness, and it's a very integrated wine when it's young, which you cannot always say about Rapley in particular. I mean, Rapley's kind of the opposite of that.
It's a really beautiful balance between the sort of soft, supple fruits, the floral characteristics. The tannins are really well integrated. It's just really easy drinking, but still interesting enough that I keep going back to the glass for another sip. This could just about pair with anything. I'm not a strict wine pairing person, but this is a charcuterie, lightly grilled meats. Your classic pairings, of course, of duck and chicken. But anything lightly grilled or a little bit of smoky characteristic, this will just be beautiful with.
There's a question about what does it mean to drink younger, and I'm gonna jump in for Michael and say I think he means that it drinks well in its youth. Is that what you're getting at, Michael?
That's what I was getting at. This wine is what we're just now releasing. This wine,
I think this wine went out in the wine club either the end of last year or this spring.
But so is my impression that I really like this wine in its youth. Yeah, it's very pretty in its youth.
There's a question about how this wine will evolve for drinking over time. Sounds like it can be drunk now. And yet, as we were kind of saying, this wine, of all of our Pinot Noir stable, really in its youth is probably the most forward. But it seems to develop with age. I think the first vintage of Razorback was 2011, and that wine is still in fine form. And I don't consider 11 to be a really, really long-lived vintage here, particularly. So it's certainly in no hurry of disappearing. You can see there, that's kind of a typical cluster coming off Razorback. So maybe 100, 150 grams. So tiny little guys. This was, that's in my hand. And you can see how, there's a lot of kind of difference in berry size. So there's some larger berries and smaller berries. And that oftentimes is a real good indicator of quality in Pinot Noir, where you have that diversity in berry morphology.
Martella's about to tell you that he has much larger hands than Nathan, so the berries would look even smaller in Martella's hand. I thought I would jump ahead for that.
Well, I could go on there for a while about that, but we'll let it go.
This is a great shot. I think this is Martella getting the tractor stuck spading in Razorback.
Could be.
That is exactly what that is.
That is my favorite tractor, for sure. And who we have here?
Blue Dog. That's in, I think that's actually in Rapley, but God, he's a good looking dog in his youth. There's another question, is fish a good choice with this wine? I would say I think salmon is a great choice with Pinot Noir, but I'll defer to John. Maybe he can talk about fish and red wine.
So for me, when it comes to wine pairing with fish, people tend to obviously think of a strict line of white with fish, and it's absolutely incorrect. Couple different factors go into making this a good fish pairing. One, the acid level is really high. Acid tends to make your mouth water, which cleanses the palate, which allows for a wider diversity of flavors. It kind of frees you up to play around with a wider array of food. So for that reason, it goes well with fish. Two, it also depends on the kind of fish. Like Nathan said, salmon goes really well, but also think of white fishes that you cook with the skin on. If you have a white fish you cook with the skin on, you tend to get a caramelization and a browning of the actual skin. That caramelization and the browning brings the wine pairing over into red wine territory, because some of those smoky characteristics and those caramelized characteristics can kind of play you across into darker wines like this one.
That's cool. So oftentimes the technique with which you prepare your fish matters as much, if not more, maybe than the actual fish, huh?
Absolutely. If you think of the analogy I always do in restaurants, I say, think of a piece of chicken. Think of it cooked on a barbecue. Think of it cooked in curry, and then think of it cooked in lemon butter. Those are different pairings. The meat stayed the same. So how you prepare the fish is more important than the fact that it is fish. If you're doing a simple cod, maybe that doesn't quite work as well. But if you have a nice bass or tilapia or a fish that has some fishes that often get served with the skin on, and if you use smokier, richer spices, then I'd definitely lean towards a Pinot.
That's great. Yeah, that's great stuff, John. Thank you for your expertise. So, Razorback is, it's as Tommy was mentioning, it's kind of become a favorite around here, because when you open a bottle, sometimes when you open some of our more structured Pinot in their youth, you're always like, this is great now, but in another year, I think maybe better. But Razorback always seems to shine in its youth, and with a little bit of air, it really, really seems to shine. So. This is one of my favorite vintages. Again, 16 is the drought vintage, so the wine has a little bit of that drought intensity, but I think it's still really well balanced and fresh.
How many cases did we get in 16?
Only 6 barrels, so 150 cases.
Not a lot out of 2 acres.
It's pretty uncommon that I can say for sure that I have a favorite vintage, or, you know, if it's multiple vineyards in the same vintage, I often can't say I have a favorite vineyard. But this, I think I can say, is my favorite vintage so far of Razorback, because that savory character is a little bit more present, I think, in the 16 than in some of the previous vintages. It's not overwhelming. It doesn't kind of overpower the prettiness and the filigree and the brightness and the red fruited character, but it's definitely there, and it adds a dimension. I think this is my favorite Razorback. I can say that.
There's another question about how drought impacts flavors, and it's a huge conversation, but I would say in general, we notice that the yields in drought vintages tend to be a bit lower. So the wines usually have an intensity and a concentration. So I would say that's probably the quick and dirty way to define a drought vintage. There's just a real intensity. There's a question about what a more typical yield would be in a non-drought year in a 2-acre vineyard. So with our older Pinot Noir vines, we hope to get 2 tons an acre. So in a 2-acre vineyard, we would hope to get 4 tons. And that would be best case scenario, about 240 cases roughly. You know, one of the issues is in the older vineyards, the spacing. So the density of planting is quite low. So it's very challenging to get the kind of yields that you want as the vines approach, 40 years of age.
Nathan, did you talk about the diverse clones in this vineyard?
That's actually a great story. Yeah, I have not talked about it yet. Do you want to tell that?
No, you tell it. You have a better memory than I do. I may have better hands. But...
So this was grafted to Pinot Noir in 2006. The original vines are from 1986. And I believe it was David Gates and his crew from Ridge that came over and did the grafting for us. And we had 4 selections of Pinot Noir. So 3 of the so-called Dijon selections, they're numbered like Boeing airplanes. So 115, 667, and 777, sort of meaningless. But this group of clones are called grouped as Dijon clones. And then a California heritage selection called Swan from Joe Swan's vineyard in the Russian River Valley. Anyway, David's crew came out, did all the work, and at the end of each vine row, they took a piece of white nursery tape and wrote in ink which each of the selections, which row each was located at, so we could know for the future for farming, which was great, so that, we were farming it the first couple of years. You don't get any fruit, the first year off of grafting. A couple of years later, when we're down there and we're nobody ever wrote it down, and so we were kind of, going, where was the Swan again? I can't remember, and went to the nursery tape. But of course, with all the sun and rain and wind, the nursery tape, the ink was completely gone. So now we have no clue, no memory of what selection is where. But I think in the long run, it's made us make better wine because we don't think about the vineyard in terms of, where's the selection? We don't harvest them separately. We harvest all those selections in kind of a blend, and I think that makes the wine kind of more complete, more complex. You can see it's a really steep vineyard from top to bottom because it's not a lot of rows. I think there's maybe 20 some rows in the vineyard, and from top to bottom, there's probably well over 100 feet of elevation change.
It's definitely an interesting vineyard to be driving the tractor in. It really keeps you awake. It is steep.
Yeah, especially at the bottom there. It's pretty wild. It's probably too steep to really farm by a tractor. Most of the bottom is farmed by hand. John, our dear friend Matt and Melissa Ryan asked, what sort of style or expression do your guests tend to prefer? He theorizes that Costa Brown is at one end of the spectrum and Razorback very much at the other end.
Well, he's not wrong. So obviously the answer to everything is it depends. We get a pretty wide spectrum. I benefit that at the Ritz-Carlton, most of our guests are of a particular level of means. What we get is someone comes in and wants Costa Brown. That's kind of what they know they want. They see it on our list, they buy it. It's not really a wine I have to sell or I try to sell. It's there for people who know they want it when they walk in the door. And yeah, that kind of falls into one end of the spectrum. In the middle end of the spectrum, you get a lot of your Russian River and your higher tone Sonoma and your West Coast, Sonoma Coast stuff. Oregon, I think something like Razorback falls under two categories. People who come in and really want to try and explore the local regions. People who have sort of gotten pigeonholed into, I always drink my Pinot Noir from Russian River Valley. What else should I be considering? Which is kind of why I have a job, is I come in and say, oh, you got to try the local wines. Something like, a lot of our guests don't really come in saying, I want X, Y, or Z. They come in saying, hey, what should I try? What's the newest thing? What's the fun thing? What's different? Or they come in saying, hey, I had X, Y, or Z. What do you have that's similar to that? So Razorback falls under that category of one, local, really well made. Acid is the key to this. There's an acid tone and a drive of bright, crisp acidity to these Pinots that I think is very indicative of Santa Cruz Mountains, that is very much a part of the core of what they represent, that sort of food pairing friendly, very delicate, very intricate, very elegant. Whereas something like Costa Brown, while delicious, is more of a big bold punch of dark fruits and black fruits. This is more of a wine you go in and you think about and you want it paired with food. I would drink this straight up, but I also would love to have something to eat with it. So that's a different kind of approach that I would lean towards this wine.
Right on, man. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you for joining us again. I think that insight is great for not only myself, but I bet all of our guests here. So, any final words about Razorback, or maybe we should move on to Rapley? So we'll move on to 2016 Rapley Trail Vineyard Santa Cruz Mountain Pinot Noir. I'm going to pour some for Tommy and myself, so I'm going to duck out.
And again, I'll mention while Nathan's pouring these wines, I'm looking at the number of folks in the lobby as attendees and participants and guests and everything, and there's quite a few people here who I believe have not joined us before on one of these, but we are we're in the business of selling wine, of course, and one of the ways that we're trying to keep people engaged and keep people interested and informed about what we're doing is to have them taste these wines with us. So again, you can reach out to us, and Dushan's going to repeatedly put the information in the chat and other places where we're visible here. And you can put these wines in your hands for next week or the week after. We're going to do these every Friday at 5 o'clock Pacific. So that's how that works.
While you guys are getting your wines ready, I saw a question in the Q&A about what do I describe as the difference between Sonoma and Santa Cruz Mountains. The honest answer to that is it depends where in Sonoma. If you talk about some of the higher Appalachian areas of West Sonoma Coast, you might be looking at high tone, bright acidity. But for the vast majority of Sonoma, what you get is probably just a higher number of sunny, warm days in a given growing season. You tend to be a little bit more towards darker fruit usually. You tend to be a little bit more weight on the palate. And the acid tends to be maybe a tick or so below what you typically find in Santa Cruz Mountains. Santa Cruz Mountains is very, like everywhere, Appalachian and microclimate driven. But Fogarty in particular, the various sites you have are elevation driven, they're cool climate driven, acid driven, and then how much fruit or intensity you get from each one obviously depends on the year. I think very spice and subtle fruit and floral characteristic driven. When people talk about the difference, they're looking for sort of the generic sort of qualifiers, sort of categories you put things into. And the honest truth is that if you go a mile down the road in any appellation, you're going to find something different. But in general, that'd be my answer.
One more thing about Sonoma to me, and every appellation, once you start figuring out what's going on, you could say that every one of them needs to be sub-appellated, but Sonoma needs it more than most. I mean, there are some wines, absolutely some of the best wines I think in the New World for sure are out on the Sonoma coast, in the far western end of the area. They're amazing wines. They're world class, but they have almost nothing to do with most of the region. I mean, most of the region has wines. I don't want to diss them, but they lack the singularity and the focus that the Sonoma coast and the deep western Sonoma stuff has.
Absolutely. Although I'll say from a sommelier's perspective, please don't make any more sub-appellations for me to memorize.
Yeah, really.
Yeah,
Please.
I don't want to. That book is already thick enough for sure.
Michael, do you want to talk about your history with Rapley Trail? I know it's been a vineyard that's kind of had a special place in your winemaking career, I would say, right?
Rapley Trail was planted about the same time originally as Windy Hill. The original planting of Windy Hill. It's planted to all, well, it was Martini clone, but I think it's Pommard. And all of Rapley's Pommard. A little bit of, we did get some cuttings from David Bruce, and which is not Pommard, but most of it was all from that Martini Pommard clone. Some cuttings also from Rene de Rosa, but that's still the same clone. We planted this in '82. And it's about, what, 5 acres? Maybe 5.5.
I think it's, almost 6 maybe, right? It's hard to tell. It's so steep.
It's steep. It's kind of hard to tell. It was planted, like the current planting Windy Hill is much more modern. This is still, Rapley was planted, like I said, in the early 80s. So it's still kind of planted more the old school spacing, which is 10 by 6. Although the steeper parts of the vineyard, we planted 11 because it was just so steep. And the steep part, we're kind of looking at the picture now, and we switched it. But if we can go back to that picture, because we can talk a little bit about, we talk about Rapley. Rapley's kind of divided up into what used to be Block B and Block M. There you go. So Block B, which is now Henry's block, is down there at the very bottom. The bottom being off to your far right. And probably the first 12, 15 rows would be Henry's block. And then what used to be middle is kind of really the middle of the vineyard. And the bottom block B always ripened 4 or 5 days a week ahead of the rest. And like all of our vineyards, we pick Rapley Trail often over 3 or 4 days, and sometimes those days could be spaced out by as much as a week to 10 days. It takes a lot longer for the top to ripen. The soil also gets a little heavier at the very top, there by Tommy's house, around Tommy's house. The soil is a lot heavier and it takes a lot more time to ripen. That's kind of a good photo to kind of show you the steepness. Over time, there's just been some natural trellising taking place.
Yeah, the terracing in that vineyard is like a lot of our vineyards. It's a little treacherous to be out there in a tractor or a quad sometimes, but it's actually kind of in areas it's actually formed in nicely where it's created nice big flat areas. The soil at the very top of the vineyard there is really an anomaly. It's actually some of the richest soil anywhere on the estate that I've seen, and it's quite dark, and it's odd because you would expect the heavier stuff to be towards the bottom, but I guess it speaks a little bit to the youth of the geologic formation around here, that we still have heavy soil towards the top of that vineyard.
That's a photograph of about the middle of the vineyard towards the bottom. Oh, there's a bobcat.
Yeah, that bobcat is sitting on a big giant piece of sandstone that was excavated from the vineyard in 82 or 81 even, maybe, when it was cleared before planting. And it's, you know, having been around there for a long time now, this stone, and I'm looking for old photographs of it, but it's gone from being a big, solid, one single piece of smooth sandstone to now it's fractured and it's falling apart and there are chunks off of it. My kids hit it with axes and hammers, so it's getting demolished slowly. But it's a neat fixture in the vineyard. That bobcat was visiting us for a while, a few years ago, a couple years ago. He'd show up every morning.
That's pretty cool. So the other thing about that vineyard, we planted that vineyard, like I said, in, I think it was 82, could have been 83, very early on. And we planted it all by hand. Now, like these days, you know, you use lasers to lay out the vineyard. What we used is wire with little beads on it, and we laid it all out by hand, pounded all those posts in by hand. It was like the three of us, the Varners and myself, did most of the work.
Speak of the devil.
There's a picture of Bob Varner. This is probably taken in 82, 83, somewhere around there, and myself. And Tommy's friends there.
Yeah, that's Jeff Frimmersdorf. I don't know if there's anyone here that remembers Jeff, but he and I went to Ladera Nursery School together when we were 3 years old, and have been good friends our entire lives. There's Chris Pieper, myself in the Hawaii shirt, and I think Jeff's in there too.
That's planting all but Tom's vineyard. That is a great photograph of your dad losing his pants.
Yeah, one of the many photo documented episodes where his pants were falling down.
Doing the cleanup at the end of the day.
Hey, there's a couple of questions here in the Q&A, and I don't want to forget, we promised to talk about whole cluster this week a little bit. Trent asks, you know, what's the difference between Old World and New World wine? Stylistically, that's a discussion that could go any direction for however long you wanted it to go. Generally speaking, when people are talking about Old World wines, they're talking about European wines that have been around a lot longer than New World wines, which would be California, the rest of North America, and the Pacific Rim, like Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, that sort of thing. Continental Europe, maybe, I guess, is the right answer. But John, you could answer that better than I probably.
I mean, you're absolutely right that that's a discussion that could go on with a back and forth argument for hours. When sommeliers refer to Old World versus New, we tend to refer to the historical differences. A lot of those differences don't exist anymore with modern winemaking techniques and modern production. But historically speaking, you would reference wines that are earth-driven, that are soil-driven, that are minerality-driven as being Old World, and wines that are fruit-driven as being New World. Obviously, that's not the case half the time you're drinking wine. The Fogarty wines, I think you could very easily find a million similarities with some of the wines from the Beaune region of France very easily in terms of the production and the flavor profile. So, that's another one of those big generalities that sommeliers are guilty of, and I think that everyone else is guilty of too. When professionals talk about wine, we talk about things, these big generalities to make them easier. Things like red wine with meat, white wine with fish. They don't necessarily apply, but we get used to them to make the conversation easy for people. But so yeah, old world versus new historically references those items. It also references sometimes the oak treatments, be them French or American oak. American oak tends to impart more coconut, more sort of vanilla or more buttery coconut-like elements, whereas French oak tends to add a sort of a soft vanillin. But it depends on how much you toast it. I mean, the winemaker Nathan and Tommy can speak to it, and Mike can speak to it better than I can. What you do to that oak makes a world of difference than just where the oak is from.
There's another question here about this was sort of answered, but I just want to address one part of the question from Kurt. There are some Sonoma Pinot Noirs specifically, and actually Littori, Hansel wineries that you mentioned. They also their Chardonnays age beautifully as well, not coincidentally probably. But I would say that some of the better Santa Cruz Mountain Pinot Noirs, in my opinion, and the Chardonnays almost unarguably, are every bit as ageable. And if you try some of we did a Mount Eden event. We were invited to a Mount Eden event several years ago where they did wines going back to the 70s at Manresa, the restaurant. And I will stack up Santa Cruz Mountain wines against any in the world, really, in terms of ageability. I truly believe that.
I'll say that in terms of the response that I put in, that I typed in, what I was referring to as when they're drinkable. I think that absolutely I agree that Santa Cruz Mountain wines can age a very long time. The acid content alone, you can let them sit and lay down, and they just hold on and become better over time.
And single vineyard wines, Matt Ryan, you're asking about how many we do, and the answer to that is probably more than we should. It's a pretty self-indulgent exercise, I always say, but one that we're not going to stop engaging in. It's just so interesting to bottle single site Pinot Noirs and other wines in this area. Will count, right? We do, starting from the lowest elevation, we do the Razorback, we do the Rapley, we do Windy Hill up here, we do Will's Cabin down at Gist Ranch. We do Mindigo Ridge, which we tasted last week here. We do the Quink's Vineyard, Vita Bella or Bella Vita. I can never remember which it is, but beautiful vineyard. We've done Munns, we've done Lester, we've done Kent Berry. A lot of interesting wines. And which would I pour first and which would I pour last? I don't really have any idea what I'd pour first. Often Rapley is last though, just because of the depth and like intensity of it. It's the one I would pour last almost always, I think.
And we haven't really talked much about this Rapley that we poured. And I think that's a good case in point. As you said, we did the Razorback first, and now we're finishing up with the Rapley here. And I think there's a reason for that, and that is the Rapley, they consider this class forever. Forever may be an exaggeration, but you can come back tomorrow and have this wine in the glass and still be alive. It's much more, it's a very kind of dense wine without being, it's not like big and big fruit. It's just kind of more dense and complex flavors. I don't know, John, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, whereas I think the savory notes of the Razorback was the first thing that struck me. On this one, it's this just beautiful florality. It's almost like if you took a bunch of rose petals and you were going to dry them out, and they weren't quite dry yet, but just started to dry out. You get that sort of soft, subtle, almost aged tone to old rose petals. It's kind of what I get in this that strikes me initially, is just this beautiful florality along with just a very subtle fruit tone. To me, the Razorback was super interesting, and I was immediately thinking what I was pairing it with. This one, I'm trying not to drink it so quickly.
There you go.
I think that that this conversation segues really well with a question from a really old friend of mine, Isaac, who actually lives really close to the winery, who I went to high school with, believe it or not. He asks, the mouthfeel seems quite different in Razorback versus the Rapley. Is that all acid content differential or something else? And I think the most interesting thing about these wines is that the acidity and the tannins are both higher in Rapley. And oftentimes you sometimes think that a wine might have higher acidity but lower tannin or vice versa. But Rapley actually just, to me, just has more intensity than Razorback. They're both sort of balanced in their own right, but Rapley just has all this kind of energy, the structure, this density, where Razorback is sort of a little more ethereal. And I think they both sort of work in their own style, but they definitely have a palate impression that's quite different when you taste them side by side, I think.
All this stuff is, of course, subjective, and Pinot Noir is one of these wines that I think people perceive it differently all the time. We have, and John, I know you'll be able to speak to this as well. People are really very opinionated and particular often about Pinot Noirs, and personally, I feel like sometimes a lot gets missed with Pinot Noirs. I hear people in our tasting room sometimes or at events saying, "Oh, you know, I just don't like Pinot Noir. I like wines that are more intense." And I'm thinking to myself, like, there isn't a lot to me that's more intense than really good Pinot Noir. Now, Pinot Noir doesn't have to have that kind of intensity. They're amazingly light in color and super bright red fruited Pinot Noirs that don't have as much tannin and don't have as much kind of texture and depth, but just so much detail. They're also amazing wines. But kind of the breed standard is wide, right? Like there's acceptable characteristics, and it can still be considered excellent Pinot Noir. And it could be very, very dark in color. It could be intense. It could have a little bit more tannin. It could be a little bit kind of girthier, you know, like the Rapley, considered excellent. And then stuff that has you know, just as a bit lighter in style would also be considered excellent. The Rapley here, I mean, Duchan, how long have we had this bottle open? How long ago did we open this Rapley? An hour ago, yeah. So it's had some time, right? And there's lots of folks that are here tasting it along with us. I don't know how long you've had yours open, but do yourselves a favor, if it's not already empty, leave some in the bottle and try it in 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. Try it tomorrow morning. I mean, the wine really calms down once it's been open for a while. And I have to admit, I love this wine. I think, et cetera, drink it. But this wine, to me, I'm thinking every time I sip it, I'm thinking, gosh, I can't wait to taste this wine.
So I think we can probably ask for any last questions. If anybody has any final questions, or if they want to make some final comments in the chat, we'll maybe get on to wrapping things up, and we can talk a little bit about Ross says this is excellent. He has this morning wine figured out. We'll get on to a quick chat about what we're going to taste next week. We've got some very exciting wines lined up. But yeah, I think today's tasting was, you know, just to wrap things up here, was a really good kind of overview of what's going on here at Fogarty Winery with regards to Pinot Noir. You sort of tasted two of our most important wines here. Again, you know, if you could see the overview of these vineyards, you know, if you're pretty good at golf, you might be able to hit a golf ball between the two. But you know, they couldn't be more different, and they're really not that far apart. So I think that to me, again, I think I may have said this before, but when I first came to this winery, that was one of the things that just really kind of blew my mind, was that how intense the site expression of all those wines, all the wines made here, has been. So that is, you know, that's the beauty of wine, really, especially at this level.
Hey, you know, we did promise last week to discuss whole cluster fermentation, our approach to it, how we do it, how it differs from wine to wine. This is, I like whole cluster. Nathan, do you want to kind of give and it's a hard thing to turn into a small conversation, but you want to talk a little bit about it, Nathan?
Yeah, we can try to do the Cliff Notes version of whole cluster. So what it basically means is you see a cluster of grapes there in the picture. With whole cluster fermentation, instead of taking the berries off the stem, as is done with a majority of red wine made today, you would include either all of the bunches with their stems or a portion. And for us in general, it's a portion of the stem, the whole stemmed clusters. So we would, on average, use between 25 or 33% of the whole clusters and add those to the bottom of the fermenter, and then destem, sort of the regular process. So take the rest of the grapes and take the stems away and add just the fruit. And you can see a picture of what a grape stem looks like without berries. And there's a machine we have called a crusher destemmer that does that. It's one of the basic pieces of capital equipment a winery has. And so the reason you might do whole cluster fermentation is to give the wine a heightened amount of aromatics, a kind of really fine texture, and a kind of what I think of as a spicy or a savory component when done well. The negative of whole cluster fermentation would be when the wine really tastes very green or vegetal. So it needs to be done with care. It needs to be done on the right fruit. And but when it's done right, I think it makes some of the most magical wines in the world. And you see it often in grapes like Pinot Noir, Syrah, some other Mediterranean varieties like Grenache, Carignan, Mataro. But outside of those varieties, I may be forgetting something else, but I would say those, like a section of Rhone varietals or Mediterranean varieties, and then Pinot Noir, those are the ones you probably see most commonly in the world. John, do you have any sommelier input on whole cluster?
I mean, whole cluster tends to have two major things that we look for when I'm doing blind tastings as a som. One, it changes the temperature and speed of fermentation to some extent by creating air pockets during the fermentation process, which tends to create a buffer zone for temperature, which can change some of the extraction. Obviously, Nathan can speak to that better than I can. But the main thing I looked for is, obviously, there could be a phenolic bitterness that can come through if too much is done. But that can also be a nice balance to fruit, depending on what your wine would have normally tasted like. It tends to be, obviously, like as Nathan said, a green note if it's kind of when it's young or when it's overdone. But there tends to be a tannic content that you get on the palate. The same way oak adds tannins and grapes add tannins, the stems can add a tannic content that you physically feel as a phenolic bitterness and as almost a grip on the mouth. So that can be positive and negative depending on what a guest or someone says they like or what you're pairing it with food-wise.
Yeah, this is a great illustration of filling a Pinot Noir fermenter. So you see there's entire bunches going into the tank. There is, you can see in the left-hand side, some dry ice in the bottom of that fermenter that's beginning to sublime. So we use whole CO2 pellets to kind of protect and cool and keep that part of the fermentation anaerobic in the beginning. And so all that CO2 will kind of help keep the grapes kind of protected until the native yeast can begin to do their work. So that's a great picture of what the beginning of the beginning of filling the fermenter might look like. And we put the whole bunches on the bottom of the fermentation because during fermentation, the whole bunches, because there's less liquid medium, they have a tendency to go into very wild, where the fermentations that we do without adding yeast, they can get, if they get dried out, there can be kind of really wild yeast or bacteria that start getting active and giving you really, really volatile aromas and flavors. And so by putting all that material at the bottom and keeping the more liquid portion on the top, that wetness kind of keeps away those those kind of unwanted yeast and bacteria. So we keep those things at the bottom. That fermenter was about 2 tons in size, Kurt. So that's the reason they go on the bottom. Matt and Melissa ask if Martella did whole cluster. Michael, did you? I don't know if we can't get your video, but if you're still here, didn't you used to use a little bit of whole bunch back in the day?
Yeah, I'm still here. I just don't have the video. Yeah, to me, it's kind of an interesting discussion about whole cluster. In the time that I've been here, I've done it all different ways, the Pinot Noir. And for me, there's not really a right answer about whether you use whole cluster or not. It really depends on your vineyard. It's vineyard specific. And it's the style that you want to make, right? It's a style of wine that you want to make, and based upon the vineyard that you have. But yeah, I've done as much as 100% whole cluster. Spent a lot of years doing total destemming, and no stems or any whole clusters. In the early years, in the 80s, we destemmed and actually crushed the fruit as it went into the tank. So I've done it all different ways. I think the style that you have kind of settled on with our vineyards, with about 30 to 20% whole clusters, really works out well. And what the stems do add, whole clusters do add, there's 2 things happening with whole clusters. One, you're adding the stems, which is giving a little bit of tannin to the wine. And it's a little bit different tannin that you would get from the seeds or that you would get from the oak. And at a little small micro level, that tannin actually adds to the feel of the palate in a very positive way. And then the other thing that happens with the whole cluster is a lot of that fermentation is taking place inside the berry. And you're getting different types of fruit components from that fermentation taken like anaerobically inside the berry. So I think what we've done with our vineyards have really worked out well using that smaller percentage of whole cluster. But yeah, we've done it all different ways at Fogarty Winery over the last 40 years.
There are people, and I know this is definitely a thing in Burgundy. I can't remember who the protagonists are here, but there are certain really well-respected producers over there that are really dogmatic about it. Like whole cluster is bad, whole cluster is good, a certain percentage of whole cluster is how you do it, and yeah, Dujac. But it's a really smart guy once told me, consistency is the prison of small minds, and I think it's got to be a case by case thing. I personally, the nicest wines I've ever tried my entire life have always had a certain amount of whole cluster, and often more than less. I really like Nebbiolo, I really like Barolo, and years ago Nathan handed me a bottle of this Berlato Barolo from a vineyard called Monvigliero, and I tried it, and it's not like one of these, like it's not a big name, that everybody knows and tries to get all the time, although people know it. But anyway, I was like, oh yeah, I think this may be my favorite Barolo ever. And then I learned a little while later that was I think the one of the very few Nathan Barolos that's done almost 100% whole cluster often. I think whole cluster adds a dimension. Of course you can overdo it.
Then you have, somebody like Henri Jaillet in Burgundy, who's maybe the most legendary winemaker ever, who if you put a stem near his fermentation would freak out and tell you that you were going to ruin the wine. So I think that's the beauty of wine, is that there's no one, as you said, Tommy, there's no one path, and everything should be done with, thought and intent and purpose. And if you sort of follow your kind of guiding light on what you're trying to do, you probably more than likely will get to the answer. And that may be with stems with Pinot Noir, may not. And hopefully you explore your site, and your site will probably, that your site will dictate whether or not stems work and, what percentage. So it's certainly a complicated topic.
Well said.
sorry, we're overtime here, and we're gonna wrap it up. Although we'll ask Martella for his final thoughts. Maybe maybe that should be something we do every week. But next week, somebody mentioned on the Facebook feed that they really are very, very fond of our Nebbiolos. Next week, I believe, Dushan, we are doing 2 Nebbiolo wines, 2016 and 2017. Is that correct? So we're gonna yeah, that's right. Nathan's got he's got the most recent stuff right behind him in that giant barrel. But next week we're gonna do Nebbiolo. I think Dushan just put the link to get your hands on the wines. So one other thing, there's a lot of people here today. The biggest group we've had between Facebook and Zoom by a long shot. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I want to also apologize we left probably 60% of the questions unanswered because there were so many. Join us again. Joy had asked a question about what we're going to do in the future, and she mentioned something about distilling. I think Joy and Todd really, really, really want to sell us some fruit to make brandy with. That seems to be what's going on. Not out of the question. We don't have a still yet, but you know, and as far as what we're going to do down the road, we'll get through this COVID stuff first, and then we'll decide. But with a still, we could make hand sanitizer, I guess. So maybe we'll look into that. Yeah. Nathan's not interested in that.
And I think Michael should come back and pioneer our distillation.
I could be in charge of the hand sanitizer. Perfect. I'll work on the tractor after
you finally arrived. You do tractor maintenance and hand sanitizer after 40 years of
I've been promoted. Fabulous.
All right, well, John, thanks for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you. We appreciate you. We appreciate the relationship that we've had with the Ritz-Carlton Half Moon Bay. We look forward to getting over there again and doing more stuff with you guys.
Me too.
Yeah,
Thanks, John.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
I think we may take for granted how amazing that place is. If you haven't been to the Ritz Half Moon Bay property, you don't know what it's all about. You owe yourself a trip there if you ever come to the winery or to the San Mateo coast. It's an amazing property, great people, great food and wine program. So
thank you. I still think you guys might have a better view, though, man.
I think it depends on the day. And I think with that, I think we'll say goodbye until next week. We'll do some Nebbiolo. It should be really, really exciting tasting. The 17 has never been seen in the wild in public before, so it'll be you if you join us and get in on the tasting, will be some of the first people to get in on it. So thank you. You got anything else, Tommy, Michael, John?
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks again.